The world was still gray when I opened the door. That kind of quiet before sunrise when even the birds seemed to wait. There, on the porch, lay something folded, soft, heavy, damp from the night. The air smelled of wet soil and cedar. For a long moment I didn't move. The porch light flickered once and I thought I saw breath rising from it, like it was alive, exhaling. The quilt, my mother's quilt. She was buried with it 3 weeks ago. I remember the way the priest's voice trembled when he said her name, how the rain started right as the coffin sank. She'd made that quilt with her own hands, tiny, uneven stitches, every square a story she never told twice. After the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to visit the grave. The house already felt too full of her absence, her perfume clinging to the curtains, the chair by the window still turned toward the morning light. I thought the quilt would rest with her forever. I thought that was the end, but there it was now, lying on my porch like it had found its way home. I bent down, hesitating. The fabric was cold, heavier than I remembered. The damp had seeped through it, darkening the faded blues and yellows she loved so much. When I lifted it, water dripped from the edges, tiny droplets catching the weak light. It wasn't just damp. It was freshly unearthed. My throat tightened. Someone had touched her grave, or something had brought it back. I carried it inside like it might fall apart in my hands. The door shut softly behind me and the house swallowed the sound. On the kitchen table, I spread it open. The fabric creaked, stiff from the cold, and there, near the corner, I saw them. 3 small letters stitched in fading gray thread. M-A-W, my mother's initials. Her handwriting, the curl of the A, the deliberate cross of the W. I'd watched her make those stitches one summer evening. She'd pricked her finger and laughed, pressing the drop of blood into the corner before it could stain. "Every quilt needs a heartbeat," she'd said. Now that same corner was darker, the thread slightly frayed but unmistakable. A cruel joke, I told myself. Someone must have taken it, made a copy, wanted to scare me. But who would do something like that? The smell of the quilt told me otherwise. It wasn't new. It smelled of dirt, of old pine, of something that had been sleeping beneath the ground. I ran my hand across the surface. The fabric was uneven, some patches looser, others drawn tight. The more I touched it, the more I felt it. The heaviness wasn't just in its weight. It was in the way it held on to warmth, as if it had kept something alive. The window above the sink caught the first trace of dawn. Pale orange light slid across the room, landing on the quilt. The colors came alive in it. Faded pinks, soft blues, the white square she'd called the sky. And then, for a moment, I could almost hear her humming. That low tune she used to hum when she sewed, half lullaby, half memory. It slipped through the silence like smoke. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound stayed. Not outside, inside. I went to the sink and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection in the window looked pale, smaller somehow. Behind me, the quilt lay still, except one corner had folded over. It wasn't like that before. I stepped closer. The fabric shimmered slightly, and I saw tiny grains of soil caught in the stitching. Dark, wet earth. I brushed them away, and one stuck to my fingertip. Black, rich, and cold. Grave soil. The realization came slowly, like a bruise spreading beneath the skin. Someone had dug her up. Someone had touched her, unwrapped this quilt, and left it here. For me. My heart ached with something sharp and strange. Not fear, not yet. More like betrayal, because it felt personal. Whoever did this, they knew where she rested. They knew how much this quilt meant. I went to the window and looked out at the yard. The grass shimmered with dew, the fence line dissolving into fog. And for a second, I swear, I saw movement near the edge of the trees. A shadow, long and still, someone watching, but when I blinked, it was gone. The birds began to sing, their notes thin and distant. The sky had turned soft pink now, light spilling gently across the fields. It should have been beautiful, but it wasn't. I sat at the table, staring at the quilt as the morning grew brighter. Every piece of it told a story. The floral patch from her wedding dress, the plaid from my father's old shirt, the white lace she never used but couldn't throw away. And now, it carried something else, something I couldn't name. I thought about putting it away, hiding it in a box, pretending I'd never seen it. But my hands wouldn't move. Instead, I folded it carefully, pressing each edge into place just as she had done. The red sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the floorboards. When I lifted it again, I could swear the fabric exhaled, the same sound the earth makes when you dig too deep. I stood there, holding it close, the scent of soil thick between the folds, and I whispered, almost afraid to hear my own voice. "Who brought you home, Mama?" The house didn't answer. Only the floor creaked, slow, deliberate, like something beneath it had shifted. Morning came quietly that day. The kind of light that feels unsure of itself, pale, hesitant, slow to touch the walls. The quilt lay where I'd left it, spread across the table like a body waiting to be dressed. I was making coffee when I saw it, that single line of red, thin, bright, out of place. It gleamed against the faded blues like a wound that refused to close. I hadn't slept much the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the quilt lying on my porch, damp and heavy. The scent of earth still clung to it, sweet and rotten at once. The kettle hissed softly, and I tried to focus on the small, normal sounds. The ticking clock, the rustle of the curtains in the draft. But my gaze kept drifting back to that red stitch. It hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. Every thread on that quilt had passed through my fingers 100 times. I knew its map by heart. This new thread looked too clean, too deliberate. The color of fresh blood, I leaned closer. It glimmered faintly in the morning light, and for a second, I thought I saw movement, like it was still drying. My mother used to say red thread binds truth to memory. She'd smile when she said it, eyes soft but distant. I never understood what she meant, not until now. I ran my finger along the thread, half expecting it to smear. It didn't. It was tight, precise, the kind of stitch only my mother could make. My chest tightened. The air in the kitchen felt thick, heavier than before. I pulled a chair close and sat down. The wood creaked beneath me. Outside, the morning was beginning, the soft buzz of life, the sound of someone's dog barking in the distance. But in that room, it was just me and the quilt. I traced the red line again. It started near the center square, the one made from my father's old shirt, and stopped abruptly, like the beginning of a signature cut short. The sight of it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I thought of her hands, those small, capable hands that always smelled of soap and fabric dye. How she'd hum while she worked, low and tuneless, like a secret meant only for herself. "Red holds the story," she once told me. "It keeps what words can't." I hadn't thought of that in years. Now, sitting there, watching the sunlight slide slowly across the fabric, I felt like she was trying to speak again. Through thread, through silence, through something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. Turning point that night, I couldn't shake the image of it. Even with the lights off, I could see the red stitch glowing faintly in my mind, like a thread leading somewhere I didn't want to follow. Sleep came slow. When it finally did, it wasn't kind. I dreamt of her. She was sitting at her sewing machine, the old one with the squeaky pedal. The bulb above her cast a yellow light that made her face look almost golden. Her hands moved fast, smoother than they ever had when she was alive. She didn't look up. The hum of the machine filled the room, steady, rhythmic, hypnotic. And beneath it, a whisper, my name. So soft I thought I imagined it, then louder. More insistent, like she was trying to draw me closer. I stepped toward her, but every time I did, the floor stretched longer. The distance between us grew. The sound of stitching turned sharper, like a heartbeat quickening. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes weren't hers. They were bright red, like the thread, "Don't forget," she whispered. "It's still open." I woke gasping, the room drenched in moonlight. The quilt lay folded neatly on the chair across from my bed, and that red stitch, it caught the moonlight like a blade. I got up slowly, every movement careful, as if the air itself might shatter. When I touched the fabric, it felt warm, not from me, from something else. I stood there for a long time, staring at it in the half-dark. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing the window pane with dry leaves. The sound reminded me of fabric brushing against fabric, the slow rhythm of my mother's work. The red thread was the only color that refused to fade, alive, bright, beckoning. I thought about what she said once, years ago, when I asked why she used so much red in her quilts. "Because it never lies," she told me. "Red always tells on you." Now that truth sat there, stitched into my mother's final gift. A single red line. Still open, still waiting. I folded the quilt over my arm, and the scent of her filled the air. Lavender, smoke, and something like rain. My voice barely made a sound when I whispered, "What are you trying to tell me, Mama?" No answer came. Just the soft creak of the house settling, like someone moving quietly through the walls. And when I looked back down, I swear the red stitch had grown longer. It started with the sound of gravel shifting. Not loud, just enough to catch the ear like someone taking one careful step too close. When I looked up from the garden, I saw him, a tall figure standing by the fence line, wrapped in a gray coat that looked older than he was. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, like the morning mist had decided to take shape and watch. The days after the red stitch felt strange, stretched thin. I tried to go about things the way I used to, making coffee, feeding the chickens, pretending the quilt was just fabric again, but something had shifted in the air. A quiet I couldn't shake. Every evening I'd find the latch on the gate undone. At first I thought it was the wind. Then the footprints appeared, heavy, deep, the kind that didn't belong to anyone I knew. By the third morning, the neighbor called. Said she'd seen a man by the cemetery at night, tall in a gray coat. Didn't carry a light, just stood by the graves like he was waiting for something to rise. I told her not to joke like that. But she swore it was true. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the fog roll over the field. And sure enough, there he was, a faint shape by the fence, too still to be wind. The next morning, I decided to see for myself. The grass was wet with dew, the kind that soaks your shoes in seconds. I walked slow, my breath visible in the cold air. He was there again, exactly where he'd been before. The same gray coat, the same stillness. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice softer than I meant it to be. Nothing. I stepped closer, heart knocking against my ribs. He didn't move until I reached the fence. That's when he lifted his head. His face was pale, worn. The kind of face that's seen too many winters. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They weren't wild or threatening, just heavy, like they carried something that didn't belong to him. "You shouldn't have it," he said finally. His voice was quiet. "Careful." I frowned. "Have what?" His gaze dropped, to the quilt draped over my arm. I hadn't even realized I'd brought it outside. "It wasn't meant to stay buried," he murmured. Then he turned, just like that, and started down the dirt road, slow, steady, as if the world behind him no longer mattered. I stood there long after he was gone, the wind tugging at the hem of my coat. It wasn't meant to stay buried. The words looped in my mind, hollow and strange. I looked down at the quilt, the red stitch catching the morning light. It shimmered faintly, like it was listening. The neighbor's warning echoed again, about the cemetery, about the man. Had he come from there? I walked back to the house, every step heavier than the last. By the time I reached the porch, my fingers were trembling. Inside, I spread the quilt out across the table. The red stitch hadn't changed, but something about the fabric felt different. Colder. I pressed my ear against it, not sure why. For a moment, I thought I heard something beneath the threads. Not words, exactly. More like the faint rhythm of breathing. I pulled back quickly, heart racing. Who was he? How did he know? I looked out the window again, but the road was empty. Just fog and the sound of crows circling over the field. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling he was near, just beyond sight, waiting for me to notice. That night, I locked every door. Even the ones I hadn't touched in years. The house felt different in the dark, smaller somehow, listening. I sat by the table, the quilt folded in my lap. The red thread glowed faintly in the lamplight, soft but alive. I kept hearing his voice, that quiet warning. It wasn't meant to stay buried. I whispered it aloud once, just to see how it sounded in my own mouth. The words felt heavy, older than me. Through the window, I could just make out the fence line in the moonlight, silver and still. But I knew he'd be back. People like that don't just disappear, and maybe, deep down, I didn't want him to. Because if he knew the quilt, then maybe he knew her. And if he knew her, maybe he knew what she left behind. The night settled like a breath held too long. And in that stillness I realized, some things come back not to haunt you, but to finish what you never began to understand. The air in the sewing room still smelled like her, starch and lavender. The window was half open, curtain trembling with the morning wind. Light pooled over the old Singer machine, dust rising and falling in slow motion. Everything was where she'd left it. The pin cushion. The measuring tape curled like a sleeping snake. I hadn't stepped in here since the funeral. But something pulled me back that morning. A quiet pull, like a thread tightening in my chest. The door creaked when I closed it behind me, and for a moment, it felt like she might scold me for tracking dirt in. The shelves were still lined with folded fabrics, blues and creams and soft pinks. Each stack had her handwriting pinned on top. Wedding, baby blanket, mending. She always said you could measure a life by the things you patched back together. I ran my hand over the table, over tiny chalk marks and stray threads. The hum of silence in that room was heavy, like it had learned to keep secrets. In the corner, the old drawer cabinet leaned slightly to one side. That's where she used to hide her unfinished things, projects she didn't want anyone to see yet. I crouched down, tugging open drawers that stuck from years of disuse. The smell of mothballs hit first, then linen, then paper. My fingers brushed something smooth, tucked beneath a stack of floral fabric. An envelope. Yellowed. The edges softened by time. Across the front, in her careful handwriting, "For when the truth returns." The words didn't make sense, not yet. But I felt something in my chest shift, like an old door opening by itself. I sat on the floor, the light bending across my lap. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. When I lifted the flap, 3 photographs slipped out. They fell face down first, fanning across the wooden floor. I turned them over one by one. The first was my mother, younger, softer around the eyes. Her hair tied up with a ribbon I'd seen before, folded in her drawer. The second, a man beside her. Tall, dark coat, gray around the temples. He wasn't my father. My stomach tightened. I'd seen that face, by the fence. The stranger who'd watched our house in silence, his gaze steady, unreadable. The one who'd said, "It wasn't meant to stay buried." The third photo showed the two of them standing before a white wooden house I didn't recognize. My mother's hand rested lightly on his arm, the kind of touch that knew where it belonged. Beneath the photographs lay a folded square of cloth. I held it up to the light, the same faded floral print from the quilt in my room. Only this one had a red thread stitched along the edge, like a border around a secret. It matched the missing patch from the corner of the quilt, the one that had always been under repair. But it wasn't torn. It had been removed. I laid the cloth flat on the table, tracing the red stitching. The pattern was delicate, too deliberate to be random. It looped, curved, crossed itself again, almost like handwriting. My mother had always used red thread for truth work, as she called it. She said, "Red carries the memory where words can't go." As a child, I thought she meant beauty. Now, I wasn't so sure. I reached for her sewing scissors, the metal cool and patient. The sound of them clicking open made my pulse quicken. I slid the tip under the first stitch. The thread resisted, like it didn't want to let go. And then, a tear down the seam. A soft pop followed by a sliver of something tucked inside. Paper. Old. Folded and stiff from time. When I pulled it free, I realized it wasn't just paper. It was a letter. The ink had bled in places, but her handwriting was unmistakable. "If you are reading this, it means the truth has found its way home." My hands trembled. The room suddenly felt smaller, the light sharper. She wrote about a promise, one she'd made to a man before I was born. A promise to protect what they'd buried together. A secret she sewed into the quilt when the truth wasn't safe to speak. Her words broke into fragments halfway down the page. But one sentence stood clear. "He will come for it when the time is right." I stared at the man in the photograph again. His eyes, the way they looked past the camera. He wasn't watching her. He was watching whoever would find this. Me. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. The curtain brushed against my shoulder like a hand. I looked down at the cloth again, at the careful stitches she'd made. Each one now broken, frayed at the edges. The quilt in my room suddenly felt heavier than fabric. It was something else now. A map, maybe? Or a confession. The stranger's words echoed back. It wasn't meant to stay buried. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. The photographs I couldn't look at anymore. Before leaving, I turned off the light, leaving only the glow from the window. The sewing machine sat there, still as a monument. And for the first time, I thought, maybe it had been waiting, too. I closed the door quietly behind me. The sound of the latch was small, but final. Down the hall, the quilt waited, its corner patch missing, its story open. And I couldn't shake the feeling that my mother's hands were still guiding mine, one stitch at a time, pulling the truth closer. The morning mist clung low over the cemetery, soft as breath. Each gravestone stood like a held memory, quiet, waiting. My boots sank slightly with each step. The earth was still damp from rain, the kind that lingers long after the clouds have gone. I stopped at her grave. The name carved in stone had faded at the edges, like it didn't want to be remembered too clearly. Something felt wrong. The ground looked too new, a patch of earth darker than the rest, shaped by careful hands. The cemetery keeper met me near the iron gate, his hat pulled low, his voice the kind that didn't need to rise above a whisper. He said he'd found it that way 2 mornings ago. The soil had been turned, he told me, eyes steady on mine. But whoever did it, they took their time. Covered it back up clean. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He led me down the gravel path, his lantern swinging gently even though it was daylight. Every sound felt sharper. The crows on the fence, the crunch of gravel, the low hum of wind through the trees. When we stopped at her grave, I could see it clearly. The grass was flattened, pressed down in a wide circle. The soil didn't match the rest, fresh, unsettled, like a secret someone had tried to smooth over. I knelt down, brushing the dirt with my fingers. It was cold. Too cold. The keeper stood beside me in silence, hat pressed to his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled just slightly. Sometimes the dead don't rest because the living won't let them. His words stayed there, hanging in the mist, and for a moment I couldn't tell which one of us he meant. I stared at the soil, the pattern of it. Not random, not careless. Almost gentle, a faint imprint ran along the edge of the grave. Something had been pressed there. Cloth, maybe. The kind that leaves a trace when lifted too soon. I leaned closer. The outline was small, almost like the edge of a quilt. That same quilt, the one draped across my bed, stitched with secrets I still didn't understand. I looked back at the keeper. He shifted uneasily, like he already knew the question I hadn't asked. "Did you see anyone here?" I whispered. He shook his head. "No one living." Then quieter. "But I heard the gate open that night. Thought it was the wind." A robin flew down, landed near the mound of soil, and began to pick at the earth. Its wings brushed against something pale. A thread, red and frayed, half buried in the dirt. I reached for it before I could think. It came free easily, no resistance. A single strand, still bright as blood, the same red as the stitch that appeared on the quilt days ago. My breath caught. The earth seemed to hum under my palm, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat too far beneath to reach. The keeper's eyes followed my hand. "Best not to touch what's been called back," he said, but I already had. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house sounded like the scrape of a shovel. I laid the red thread on my nightstand, beside the folded quilt. The lamp's glow made it look alive, pulsing faintly in the dark. I kept hearing the keeper's voice in my head. "Sometimes the dead don't rest." It wasn't a warning. It was a truth. I went to the window and looked out at the field. The moonlight stretched across the yard, pale and thin, stopping just short of the fence line. That's where the stranger had stood. Where his shadow lingered long after he left. Now, in the moonlight, I saw movement again. Not a man this time, but the shape of something shifting just beyond the tree line. Slow. Careful. Like it didn't want to be seen. I pressed my hand to the glass. The quilt on the bed rippled, though the window was shut tight. A faint scent drifted through the air. Lavender and starch. Her scent. The thread on the nightstand curled slightly, coiling like it was remembering something. I whispered her name before I realized I'd said it aloud. And for just a moment, a heartbeat, maybe less, I swore I heard her voice answer back. Soft, close, not buried, waiting. The next morning, I went back to the cemetery alone. The air was still, the soil untouched. But at the center of the grave, a single red stitch lay across the dirt. Fresh, bright, perfectly placed. I bent down, brushing the soil aside just enough to see beneath. There, faint but visible, was the same pattern I'd found on the cloth hidden in her drawer, a message stitched into the earth itself. The beginning of a design only she could have made. I stood there a long time, until the light shifted and the shadows grew long. The wind passed through the trees, carrying that same scent of lavender, I whispered barely above breath. I found it. Mama, but the earth stayed silent, still, and somehow, that silence felt like an answer. The house was quiet but not empty. Every sound, the ticking clock, the groan of the floorboards, felt like someone breathing just out of sight. The quilt lay across my lap, heavy and warm, though it had no right to be either. The morning light bled through the curtains, soft and gold, catching on the threads like veins. My fingers traced along the edge of one dark square, darker than the rest. That's when I felt it. A corner stiff beneath the fabric. Something folded, hidden where warmth met weight. I didn't move at first, just stared at the square, at the way the stitching curved, deliberate and sure. My mother's hands had made this quilt in her final years. Each patch told a story, or so she used to say. A piece of an old dress, a kitchen curtain, a sleeve from my father's shirt. She stitched memories when she couldn't speak them. I set the quilt on the table, the light stretching long across the fabric. My hands trembled as I found the thread I didn't recognize, a faint seam too new to belong. With a small pair of scissors, I cut carefully, slow enough to hear the thread snap one fiber at a time. The sound was delicate but sharp, like pulling at a wound that had healed wrong. Inside, something rustled, a slip of paper, folded small, almost afraid to be seen. I unfolded it with both hands, the creases deep, like it had been waiting for years to breathe. The ink had bled slightly into the fabric fibers, but the handwriting, that tremble, that slant. I'd know it anywhere. My mother. And beneath her hand, only one line. "If you ever find this," it read. "He knows the truth about your father." The words blurred before I finished them. I blinked hard, trying to see straight, but my throat had already closed around something too heavy to swallow. I whispered the sentence out loud, testing it against the air. The house didn't answer. I read it again, and again, until the words lost meaning and became sound. Soft, broken sound. "He knows the truth about your father." I turned the letter over, hoping for more. A name. A clue. Something. But there was nothing. Only the faint impression of her pen pressing too hard into the paper. I laid it beside the quilt and just stared. My father had been gone for years. Buried before her, before I was ready. He was quiet, gentle, the kind of man who mended fences and never raised his voice. At least, that's what I'd believed. That's what she told me. But now, in that single trembling line, my mother had undone decades of peace. Who was he? The stranger by the fence? The man in the photograph? The light shifted, creeping away from the letter, leaving it half in shadow. And I realized then, whatever truth she'd buried, it hadn't stayed buried long. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the kettle cooled. The letter was spread before me, the quilt folded neatly at my side like an old friend who knew too much. The house seemed to hum softly, a low vibration in the walls, in the air. It was the same feeling I'd had at her grave, the feeling of something unfinished. I thought about the stranger in the gray coat, the way his eyes lingered on the quilt, the way his words had crawled beneath my skin. It wasn't meant to stay buried. Was he the one she meant? Was he the truth? I unfolded the letter again, my thumb tracing the edge where her pen had stopped. There was a faint mark beneath the ink, a smudge, almost circular, like a drop of something wet had fallen and dried there. Tears? Or blood? The thought chilled me, though I didn't know why. I turned to the window. The field was still, but the fence line looked different in the moonlight, darker in one spot, as if someone stood there again, waiting. The air in the house shifted. A slow creak came from the hallway. For a moment, I almost said her name, but instead, I whispered his father. And in the silence that followed, something inside the walls seemed to sigh. By morning, I'd folded the letter back into the quilt. I couldn't bring myself to leave it out. It belonged there, hidden, breathing beneath the fabric where she'd left it. Outside, the sun rose pale and low, brushing gold across the windows. The world looked the same, but I didn't feel the same inside it. I stood at the table, my hand pressed to that dark square, the one that had kept her secret safe for so long. "If you ever find this," she'd written, and I had, but I wasn't ready for the truth to find me back. The wind moved softly through the yard, lifting dust, whispering through the cracks. And for the first time, I understood what she meant when she said some stitches aren't meant to be undone. The storm came in slow, not all at once, but with a hum beneath the walls, like the house was warning me. I was sitting by the window, watching the trees bend, when the first flash lit the sky. The power flickered, then went dark. Only the candle on the table stayed alive, its small flame trembling against the quilt draped over the chair. I remember thinking how still it looked, how innocent, until it moved, or maybe it was just the light. The room smelled of rain and old thread. Every corner whispered of her, my mother, the woman who had sewn that quilt with hands that never rested. I'd spread it across my lap earlier, tracing the red stitch that had always bothered me. Too bright, too alive against the soft blues and creams. The wind pressed against the glass, a long, low moan. I pulled the quilt tighter. Outside, thunder rolled down the hills like something heavy being dragged. When the lightning came again, I saw my own reflection in the window, pale, tired. Behind it, the candlelight flickered, and for a moment the quilt seemed to breathe. I whispered into the silence, "Stop it, Mama." "You're gone. You're gone." But the house didn't believe me. The air felt too thick, like it remembered something I didn't. Another flash. The red thread caught the light. It wasn't straight anymore. It curved, a new bend that hadn't been there before. My hands trembled. I ran my fingers along it. The fabric was warm. That's when I realized the thread wasn't just red. It was spreading. I leaned closer, holding the candle near. The flame wavered over the quilt, revealing a thin red line that twisted across the surface, not stitched by hand, but bleeding through like ink under water. It curved and swirled, looping into a shape I didn't recognize. Every flash of lightning brought it further to life. The wind howled through a crack in the window pane. The house creaked, groaned, shifted. I stood, clutching the quilt against me. My breath fogged the air. In the half-dark, the red line shimmered, stretching toward the corner of the cloth, then stopped. As though pointing, I turned the quilt over, searching for logic. For a seam undone or thread loosened? Nothing. But when I laid it flat again, I saw it, a trail. A path stitched into the pattern itself, one I had never noticed before. It wound from the center outward toward the edge, then vanished into the corner fold. The candle sputtered. Something in me wanted to throw the whole thing into the fire. But another part, the quiet, stubborn part that carried my mother's eyes, needed to know where it led. Outside, thunder cracked open the sky. And for a moment, the lightning showed something through the window. A figure, still, near the old barn. At first, I thought it was the fence post. The way it always stood crooked, leaning into the wind like it was listening. But then it moved. Not much. Just a tilt of the head, a shift of weight. Enough to make my heart stumble. I whispered into the dark, "Who's there?" My voice was swallowed by the storm. The quilt slid from my arms, pooling at my feet. The red stitch caught my eye again. No longer just a line, but a curve that mirrored the path from the back door to the barn. My mother's hands had known this land better than anyone. Every tree, every stone. If she'd hidden something, she would have done it where the earth could keep its secret. I picked up the candle, shielding its light with my palm, and stepped toward the door. The handle was cold. When I opened it, the wind burst in, wet and wild. The flame died, leaving only darkness and the pulse of the storm. Lightning cracked again, white and sharp. The figure was still there. Closer now, I should have turned back. But something, the red thread, the letter, the years of unanswered questions, pushed me forward. The rain hit my face like memory. The barn loomed in the distance, a black mouth against the storm. And just for a heartbeat, I swore I heard her voice, follow it. The wind swallowed the sound as quick as it came. I stepped into the mud, barefoot, the earth cold and alive beneath me. The quilt trailed from my shoulders like a shroud, its red stitch gleaming under every flash of lightning, leading me forward, thread by thread. When I reached the gate, I turned once, back toward the house. It stood silent, one window glowing faintly from the candle I'd left behind. Then I looked at the barn. The figure was gone, but the doors, they were open. The rain softened. The storm began to drift east, and through the quiet I felt it, a pull, steady and low, guiding me toward the dark. The red thread on the quilt trembled against my skin, like it was breathing again, and this time, I didn't look away. The rain had thinned to a whisper. Just the soft hiss of water running off the roof, and the barn breathing quietly in the dark. I stood there for a long time, the quilt still clutched around my shoulders, the red stitch glimmering faintly like a pulse. The doors creaked as I pushed them open. The smell of wet wood and rust hit first, the scent of things forgotten. Inside, the air felt heavy, swollen with years. And when the lightning came again, I saw it. a faint outline behind the far wall. A seam that didn't belong. The barn had always been a place of sound. Cows lowing, ropes swinging, my mother humming as she worked. Now it was nothing but silence, the kind that presses against your ribs. I walked slowly, my boots sinking into the damp earth. Every step stirred up the smell of hay, dust and rain-soaked wood. The wall in front of me looked wrong. Uneven boards. Newer nails. Mama had always said the barn was built by her father. But this part felt like it came later. The quilt slipped from my shoulders. It fell quietly, the red thread glowing against the dirt like a warning. I reached out and pressed my hand against the wall. The wood was softer than it should have been, hollow underneath. My fingers found the edge of a panel. Something inside me hesitated, like crossing a threshold I couldn't return from. But then I remembered her handwriting. "If you ever find this, he knows the truth about your father." I pressed harder. The board shifted with a low groan. Behind it, darkness. A small door, half buried, half forgotten, and for the first time in years, I said her name aloud. "Mama, what did you hide?" The cellar smelled of damp metal and mildew. I found the latch by touch, rusted and stubborn. When it finally gave, the floor shuddered, like the barn itself exhaled. The candle's flame bent low as I descended, one careful step at a time. The walls were stone, cold and sweating. Cobwebs hung like lace curtains, trembling in the draft. At the bottom, my light caught something, a row of old boxes stacked neatly against the wall. I knelt beside them, brushing off layers of dust that rose in soft clouds. The lids were swollen shut, paper soft with age. When I pried one open, the smell of old paper hit me, sharp, like time itself had a scent. Inside were letters, their ink faded to ghosts. Photographs too, water-stained but still alive in places. Mama's face appeared again and again, younger, smiling. Beside her, the same man from the fence. In one photo they stood together in a field of tall grass, the wind caught in her hair. In another, she was holding a baby, my breath caught. The child wasn't me. The features, the eyes, the mouth, were different. My hands began to shake. I held the photo close, tracing the outline of their faces. Half of it was burned away, the edges curled and blackened like someone had tried to erase the truth but couldn't. For a long while, I just sat there on the cold floor, the candle flickering in my lap. Rain dripped softly through the boards above, counting seconds. The photo trembled in my hand. My mother's smile, that same gentle curve I'd seen 1,000 times, now felt like a question. I searched the other boxes, desperate for something that made sense. Old letters, sealed envelopes, fabric scraps, pieces of a life folded into secrecy. In one box, I found a bundle wrapped in cloth. When I untied it, a small silver rattle rolled out. It bore the initials EM. "My name is not those initials," I whispered them out loud anyway. EM. The sound barely left my throat. Was this child hers? His? Mine in some other way I couldn't yet understand? The candlelight shimmered across the cellar walls, making the shadows move. For a moment, I thought I saw her, my mother, standing by the stairs just watching. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. All her silence had led here, every word she hadn't said. Every time she'd looked away when I'd asked about my father. It was all right here, buried beneath our home, a secret wrapped in wood, cloth, and guilt. I pressed the burned photograph against my chest, my heart thudding beneath it. "Mama," I whispered. "Who was he?" The storm above answered for her, a low rumble, fading into distance. I sat there until the candle died, its smoke curling up toward the cellar ceiling like a sigh. The air grew colder, the rain quieter. When I finally stood, the quilt waited at the top of the stairs, right where I'd left it. The red thread shimmered faintly in the moonlight leaking through the cracks. I draped it around my shoulders again. It felt heavier now, like it knew something I didn't. In my hand, I still held the burned photograph, her, him, and the baby with no name. I looked toward the barn door, where the night waited just beyond. The wind moved through the grass, slow and steady, as if whispering directions I couldn't yet hear. I took one last look at the cellar. Then I closed the door, and for the first time, I realized the truth wasn't buried. It was waiting for me to be ready to see it. The knock was soft, almost swallowed by the rain, but in the silence of the house it rang sharp. I froze by the window, watching sheets of water run down the porch. When I opened the door, he was there, soaked through, the quilt clutched tightly in his arms. The storm framed him like a silhouette, tall, wet, and silent. I didn't know if I should step back or reach for him. The quilt, my mother's, rested between us, heavy with years and secrets. His eyes met mine. And in that look, I saw a past I'd never been allowed to touch. He smelled of rain and earth, wet and honest. I let him in, and the door clicked closed behind him, sealing the storm outside. The quilt was folded across his arms, as if it weighed on him too. I touched it carefully, almost afraid it would vanish in my hands. He didn't speak at first, just set it down on the table and ran his fingers along the stitching. The red thread shimmered in the dim light, glowing like a pulse between us. I wanted to ask him who he was, wanted to demand answers, but something in the way he breathed, the way the candlelight trembled on his face, stopped me. Finally, he spoke. His voice low, breaking against the quiet. I knew her first. Before everything, the words hung in the air. I felt the floor shift beneath me, before the storm, before my father, before my life had seemed simple. She had loved him, and now he was here, returning the past in the form of a quilt, soaked and heavy. He told me about her in a voice that trembled, as if each word carried decades of memory. They were young. She had laughed easily, loved openly. The world hadn't yet hardened them. Then he paused, glancing down at the quilt. "This baby," he said softly, pulling a photograph from inside one of the folds. The same one I had seen in the cellar, her holding the small child, half erased, edges burned. "It's ours," he whispered. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. My father? He never knew. I promised her when she grew ill, that I'd wait. Wait until you were ready. Until the time was right. And now, he lifted the quilt slightly, letting me feel the weight of it. It's hers, all of it. She wanted you to see her whole story. I traced the red stitch, my fingers trembling. The baby, the photograph, the hidden letters, everything my mother had kept, the secrets, the shame, the love she thought I couldn't understand, was here, in my hands. I looked at him, searching for anger, for betrayal, for reason. He only shook his head, rain dripping from his coat onto the floor. Why her? Why not me? I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. He sat down slowly, the quilt folded between us like a fragile barrier. "I think she knew," he said finally, voice cracking. "She knew you'd need time. That some truths are too big to hand over too soon." His eyes glistened. I saw the weight of her illness, the promises she had made, and the years he had waited, faithful to her memory. "I never thought I'd see you," he admitted. "But she made me promise." The storm outside softened into a drizzle. The candle flickered. I felt a strange calm settle in the room, quiet, fragile. I lifted the quilt slowly, touching the worn patches, the red stitch that had guided me here. The weight of her hand seemed to press against mine. Her love, her fear, her story, everything stitched into thread and cloth. He watched me, patient, silent, waiting for me to understand without explaining further. I felt tears gather, not just for her, but for the life she had lived in shadows. The choices she had made to protect me, and the man who had waited all these years to keep his promise. She had trusted him with her story before she trusted me. And now I held it. The storm had passed entirely, leaving only a soft drizzle tapping against the windows. I folded the quilt carefully. letting the red stitch shimmer in the fading candlelight. He stood by the door, coat still wet, eyes lingering on the fabric. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. "Now it's yours." I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of the quilt felt like her hand on my shoulder, guiding me forward. For the first time, I understood. The secrets, the letters, the hidden photographs. They were hers to give, not mine to demand. The man by the door smiled faintly, though not with his eyes. Then, quietly, he left. The house was still. The storm gone. And in the center of it all, I held her story, heavy and whole. For the first time, I felt the past and present collide, and knew the next step I had to take. The cemetery was quiet, almost too quiet. The morning mist curled around the gravestones, soft as silk. I carried the quilt across the damp grass, the folds heavy with rain and memory. In my other hand, the letter trembled, edges worn from endless reading. Birds shifted in the trees above, their wings brushing against the mist. I stopped at her grave. The soil still dark, still soft from the storm a few nights before. For the first time, the weight of the quilt didn't feel like a secret. It felt like a story, hers, stitched with love and longing. I set it down slowly. The cemetery smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying the faint rustle of old paper and memory. I knelt beside her stone, the quilt draped across my knees like a fragile promise. For years, I had searched for pieces of her, letters hidden in drawers, photographs tucked in boxes, a red stitch that guided me through storm and shadow. All the while, I wondered if I'd ever understand her, or if some part of her would always remain untouchable. Now, holding the quilt and the letter, I felt her presence more than ever. The way the red thread glinted in the morning sun, tracing shapes I couldn't yet name. The words on the paper, trembling but unmistakable, her voice speaking across years. "If you ever find this..." I traced the stitching with my fingers, feeling each knot, each tiny imperfection, and realized she had sewn her story into the thing she loved most. She had hidden truth inside love, and in doing so, she trusted me to find it. I closed my eyes for a moment, let the wind, the mist, the quilt, and her voice wrap around me. I began to dig a small space beside her grave, careful not to disturb the flowers already set there. The earth was soft, damp from the lingering rain. The quilt folded neatly in my hands. I felt the weight of years, of stories untold, pressing against my chest. The letter, now crumpled gently in my palm, was a reminder of every step I had taken to reach this moment. The cellar, the photographs, the man at the door, the red stitch that had guided me. I pressed the quilt into the soil with deliberate care, smoothing it like a blanket over the earth. It felt strange, almost wrong, to bury her gift, the very thing she had entrusted to me, beneath the ground. But I understood now. The burial was not about hiding. It was about giving back, about returning her love to the place it belonged. I whispered her name softly, almost a prayer. "Mom, I see you now." And as I pressed the soil over the quilt, I imagined her smiling. Not sad, not sorrowful, but gentle, quietly proud. The morning light filtered through the trees, dappled like lace across the grave. I felt warmth on my hands, the wind brushing my face as though the world itself was holding its breath with me. I straightened, brushing dirt from my knees, and looked at the quilt now resting beneath the soil. The red stitch seemed to pulse in my memory, a trail that had led me here, to understanding, to forgiveness, to her. Holding the letter to my chest, I thought about all the years I had carried questions. About my father, about her choices, about the life I thought I knew. I realized that the quilt, each patch, each stitch, each hidden letter, had been her way of teaching me patience, compassion, and the quiet strength of love. It was her voice when she couldn't speak, her heart when she could not be here, and I understood something else, something heavier than sorrow. love is not always loud. Sometimes it is folded carefully, stitched into the small mundane things we touch. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath the earth, until the living are ready to accept it. I breathed in the scent of rain, of soil, of something eternal. The mist lifted slightly, revealing sunlight breaking across the gravestones. The world seemed to exhale, and in that exhale I felt a shift in myself, a soft unburdening, as though the quilt had returned not just to the earth, but to me as well. I stood for a long moment, hands pressed together, eyes fixed on the grave. The quilt beneath the soil, the letter tucked into my coat pocket. I felt her presence settle beside me like a quiet companion. The morning light filtered through the trees, painting everything in soft, golden threads. I touched the headstone, tracing her name with my fingertips. "Thank you," I whispered. "For the quilt, for the letters, for trusting me with her story." And in that moment, I understood the gentle truth she had left behind, that love can heal, quietly, beneath the earth, beneath the years, beneath our own stubborn hearts. I turned slowly toward the path, leaving the cemetery in peace. The wind carried the faint rustle of the quilt beneath the soil, a reminder that some stories live on, stitched into the fabric of memory, waiting to be found and forgiven. The morning sun seeped through the curtains in thin golden ribbons. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, catching the light like tiny stars. I opened the sewing kit my mother had kept hidden for years. The smell of old fabric, faintly sweet and earthy, rose up to meet me, scissors, thread, needles. Each piece a quiet echo of her hands, her patience, her care. I pulled out scraps of cloth I had gathered over the past weeks, colors I had chosen myself, soft blues, muted yellows, greens that reminded me of spring rain. The house was still, but it felt different, like it had been waiting for this moment. I laid the first square on my lap and let my hands remember what hers had taught me. The room smelled of fabric and sunlight. Outside, birds stirred in the trees, calling to each other softly. I sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, the sewing kit open before me, thread spilling like a river of color. For weeks, I had carried the quilt she left behind, the letters, the red stitch, all reminders of a past tangled in secrecy and love. Now, I was ready to create something of my own. Not to hide, not to bury, but to lay my grief, my memories, my choices onto something tangible. Each patch felt like a conversation. Blue for the mornings I spent crying alone, yellow for the rare sun-filled afternoons when I laughed, green for the moments of quiet hope. I hesitated before picking up the needle, feeling the weight of the past in my fingers. And then I imagined her hands over mine, gentle and guiding, not rushing, not scolding, just present. I pierced the fabric. The needle slid smoothly. A stitch at a time, I felt my heartbeat slow, the tension in my chest unraveling like the threads I pulled through the cloth. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like home again, soft, waiting, warm. Hours passed unnoticed. Sunlight shifted across the room, painting the walls with the rhythm of my work. I found myself talking softly to the quilt, as if she could hear me. "I don't know if you can see, Mom," I whispered, "but I'm trying to carry what you left and make it mine." The fabric grew under my hands, a patchwork of memory, sorrow, and tentative joy. Some pieces were frayed at the edges, remnants of old clothes I had kept for comfort. Some were fresh, bright, chosen with care. The needle slipped occasionally, pricking my finger. A drop of blood fell onto the cloth. I didn't move it. It became part of the quilt, a mark of presence, of life, of grief made tangible. I paused to breathe, letting the quilt rest across my lap. The red thread lay coiled beside me, waiting. I thought of her, the way she had stitched warnings, messages, truths into her own work. The thought shivered through me. The red stitch would come at the end, just as she had done. This quilt was different. It was mine, but it was also hers. And with every stitch, I felt her guiding me. Her hand soft on mine, steady, patient, unwavering. When I reached the final square, I hesitated. The red thread lay coiled like a heartbeat beside me. I picked it up slowly, feeling its weight, its history. This was the stitch that had led me to her secrets, to the man, to the baby, to understanding. I threaded the needle and paused, taking a deep breath. Then I pierced the final square, pulling the thread through with care. The red wound through the quilt, tracing a line that felt like connection, like completion. For a long moment, I just held the needle in place, letting the thread settle. It was more than fabric. It was a memory, a story, a legacy sewn into my own hands. Tears ran down my cheeks, unbidden, warm, and quiet. The quilt in my lap was whole. The grief that had felt so heavy for weeks now felt lighter, settled into the stitches, the colors, the care I had poured into it. I folded it gently, carrying it to the window. Sunlight streamed in, catching the red stitch and making it glow. The house, for the first time in months, felt warm, safe, alive. I hung the quilt across the window frame, letting the light shine through, painting the floor with its colors. And in that quiet, golden morning, I realized something profound. Some things must be unburied to finally rest. I stood back, hands pressed together, watching the quilt sway slightly in the morning breeze. The red stitch shimmered, a reminder of what had been hidden, what had been returned, what had been understood. I felt her presence beside me, not a ghost, not a shadow, but a whisper of love and guidance. The grief that had been heavy in my chest now felt like a folded cloth, soft and manageable, stitched into something tangible and beautiful. Outside, the birds called again. The house was quiet but alive. I took a deep breath, letting the warmth settle in my bones. Perhaps this is what she wanted. Not secrets buried, not truths hidden, but a heart open enough to stitch them into life. And maybe this is how love heals. Quietly, stitch by stitch, in light, in memory, in the rhythm of hands at work. I touched the quilt one last time and whispered, "Thank you, Mom. I see you now." The sun caught the red thread, and for the first time, the house felt like home again,